Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Sunday, June 2nd. This is day 240 since October 7th. President Biden, as I talked about yesterday, put a ceasefire proposal on the table, stating that Israel had previously agreed to the proposal. And he also put a fair amount of pressure on the Israelis to accept the deal if the Hamas leadership in Gaza, Sinwar, and others did so as well. As of this morning, Sunday morning, June 2nd, John Kirby, a spokesperson for the National Security Council, told ABC News that the Biden administration had, quote, every expectation that Israel would move forward with a proposed ceasefire plan laid out by President Biden if Hamas also agreed to the proposal. Two far-right coalition partners in the Netanyahu war government, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, threatened last night, Saturday night, to quit his government should he agree to the ceasefire agreement. If both of those far-right parties left the Netanyahu coalition, it would mark the end of Netanyahu's government in Israel. At the same time, thousands of protesters in Tel Aviv today on Sunday put pressure on the Israeli government to accept the latest proposal. And that's kind of where things stand. So there's this proposal on the table, a three-part agreement for the potential of the release of hostages, ultimately for a ceasefire agreement. Since it's Sunday, I thought I would share a short reflection with you today, but wanted to let you know where things stand since President Biden's announcement yesterday. I've been reading a lot from South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement, specifically looking at what role Christian leaders in the church played during the decades-long and honestly centuries-long struggle for Black liberation in South Africa, and the critical role that the church played in the anti-apartheid movement. I'm currently reading a book called Pharaohs on Both Sides of the Blood Red Waters by Alan Aubrey Bosak. Bosak is currently the first holder of the Desmond Tutu Chair of Peace, Justice, and Reconciliation Studies at Christian Theological Seminary and Butler University in Indianapolis. He's South African. He's from the Dutch Reformed Church. He's a cleric there, a politician, an anti-apartheid activist. His history is rather complicated, actually. I'd encourage you to take a look. I mean, he was criticized for embezzlement and then was reinstated and has quite a profound role. He was sentenced to prison for fraud in 1999. He was subsequently granted an official pardon and reinstated as a cleric in late 2004. He, along with the white South African Afrikaners leader Beyers Naudé and Winnie Mandela, won the 1985 Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award. And with that in mind, I thought that we could take a look at the role of the global church and what that might encourage us, what that might tell us about the role of the church in this particular moment. You know, at Churches for Middle East Peace, our role is specifically to educate and lead our constituents in the United States, but particularly what role might the church in the US and the Western world play prophetically and courageously as we seek to engage in this moment in light of all that's happening in Gaza, all that's happening in Israel. As Gaza continues to suffer mass killings, and what many around the world are calling nothing less than a genocide, as the humanitarian crisis there is one of the worst that we have seen in contemporary times. There continue to be severe deficiencies in water, food, access to healthcare. The question isn't even how can we make it better or how can we address the needs, because each and every day there are more and more needs, and each and every day there's more and more killings and bombings and death. And I think for those of us in the United States, it's important to understand the role that we play when the bombs that are used, or many of them, or many of the weapons that are used, are actually made and manufactured in the United States. And as we look at the fact that hostages have been held there for now more than 240 days, as we look at the fact that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinian prisoners who've been held without due process, as we look at the abhorrent conditions of Israeli prisons, you know, these are just some of the most acute issues. Not even talking about the increase in the building of settlements or the increase in settler violence or the lack of freedom of movement or the ongoing realities of Israeli occupation and other human rights abuses, violations of international law. We could spend a lot of time just talking about the current realities. But what I want to talk about is what is the role of the church and what should our response be in the United States and around the world? And I think it's important for us to understand that the response of the church has not been monolithic. So when we hear critiques coming out from Palestinian Christians, you know, towards the church in the United States, that the church has not responded monolithically, but sometimes because we live in a world of sound bites and social media and quick just summaries, and I'm guilty of this too, we try to oversimplify. Many in the church have responded and are leading the way in terms of a prophetic response, but many others have not engaged or have not mobilized. And many in the church are remaining silent. And I believe that at a minimum, our response should be saying enough death, enough violence, these atrocities must be brought to an end. Enough is enough. That Jesus, the Prince of Peace, would say that the violence that's happening in Gaza must end and should end now for the sake of the humanity of the Palestinian people as a starting point. But not only that, for the sake of Israel, for the sake of the broader Middle East, for the sake of the United States, for the sake of our own humanity. So what kind of world allows what's been going on and the atrocities to continue for one day, let alone for 240? There was great criticism this past month as the Met Gala occurred with the theme Sleeping Beauty, Reawakening Fashion, and memes all over the internet compared what's happening today in the world. They compared these pictures of these elaborate dresses and these stunning, glamour and, this opulence. The comparison was made to this world of the Hunger Games, this idea that in New York City, there was one world and in Gaza, there's another. And what allowed us today, in this moment in time, to become so separated from one another that we could ignore those who are living, perhaps thousands of miles away, but who are living without water, or who are living without food, or who are suffering from literally daily bombings, if not bombings, several hours a day. Or, for Israelis who've been crying out for their loved ones who've been taken captive to be returned home. And so how can we ignore that? And how can our daily reality be so far apart from their daily reality? I've been reading a book by a gentleman named Bosak. He wrote a book called Pharaohs on Both Sides of the Blood Red Waters. And in that book, there's a chapter called A Hope Unprepared to Accept Things as They Are. And I think that's the role of the church, that we need to have a hope that says we do not accept things the way that they are. I think that's a good place for us to start. Might we embrace a theology that says this is not good enough, this is not okay. And Bosak says that as a part of the church's responsibility, it's to speak truth from the edge. He says with an edge that's prophetic and political, it comes from the edge that Jesus himself gave to his own ministry in the proclamation of the kingdom of God. And in his embrace of the struggles of the poor and the powerless in such stark contrast and in opposition to the reign of Caesar in Rome and the temple elites in Jerusalem. He says that struggle reminding earthly powers and authorities about the limits of their power and the criteria for judging their rule. It continues. Might we be encouraged by and reminded by the teachings of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose vision of prophetic justice and the prophetic church and the call to costly discipleship and righteous choices and sacrificial witness, where King described the role of the church as a church driven by the radical gospel of compassionate justice, hope, and liberation, who understood the call to costly discipleship, righteous choices, and sacrificial witness. King says that one of the first places to start, particularly as the white church and the church of privilege, he, of course, was speaking, in light of the civil rights struggle of the 1960s and the mid-20th century in the United States. But in that moment, he said, well-intentioned white moderates who could not understand the impatience of the Black oppressed people of America. They could not understanding that they cannot set the timetable for the Negro's freedom, representatives of the white church that appears to be more white than Christian, seeking safety behind the security of stained glass windows, too trapped in their own whiteness to realize that speaking truth to power meant in the first place speaking to themselves in their own privileged positions. Might this be a place for us to start, as Western and American Christians, to not be afraid to acknowledge our own position of privilege, our own complicity, our own participation in the injustices that have been perpetuated upon Palestine and other parts of the Middle East, that we have dehumanized the Palestinian people. And in many ways, it comes from our own complicity and privilege, that we might start by acknowledging our own power and privilege, and that might empower us to then be able to speak boldly truth to power. As Bosak writes, to end aggression and war, to seek a better, more just, more humane world in the doing of injustice, in the undoing of injustice and in the doing of justice, to save the earth from calamities of our greed and rapaciousness, to restore human dignity as we protect and enhance human rights, to become the embodiment of home for young and old, to believe that it is not wrong to dream and hope and work for justice. to reclaim the Bible from the distortions of those who wish to use it for justification for injustice, inhumanity, and ideologies of domination and violence. This is to reduce our theology. This is a call to discipleship and living out prophetic theology. It's following in the footsteps of leaders like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King Jr., where Bonhoeffer manifested and identified as a Christ-centered realism who knows that when Christ calls us, he also calls us to die. And a call to discipleship like that of King, who calls on us to remember that our life is not worth living if we have not found something that is willing to die for. South African theologian John de Gruchy says, God's reign is always on behalf of those who suffer and those who are oppressed. And we celebrate every achievement of justice, no matter how small, knowing that it is a step towards the coming of God's kingdom. So might we continue to work towards that end, towards an end to all violence, to all injustice, to the prevention of genocide in Gaza, to the release of all captives and all oppressed, for the sake of justice and for the sake of peace. Amen.